Committee on Housing and Insurance will come to order. Today's hearing is entitled HUD's Role in Rental Assistance, an Overview and Review of Legislative Proposals. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any time. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the Chair for inclusion in the record. Without objection, members of the full committee who are not members of this subcommittee may participate in today's hearing for the purpose of making an opening statement and questioning witnesses. The Chair now recognizes himself for 3 minutes for an opening statement. I first want to thank our witnesses for their participation in this hearing today as we continue to look at how we can reform various programs at HUD and, that are intended to provide low-income families with taxpayer-assisted housing while incentivizing self-sufficiency and increasing opportunities for employment. I would just note that we're starting a bit late because we did have votes on the floor and it's taken a while for everyone to get to the committee room, so I apologize for that. Now, if you watched last week's hearing, you'll know that we are now participating in Speaker Ryan's A Better Way agenda with the goal of fighting poverty. We received a number of good suggestions that we hope to address in the discussion drafts presented last week, and I'm looking forward to suggestions and takeaways from this hearing today as well. Well, last week we highlighted how we can reform HUD's housing choice voucher program to further the goal of self-sufficiency. It also became clear that there are other issues in HUD's housing assistance programs that require our attention. One consistent theme from last week's hearing was how to incentivize public housing authorities to focus on the person they are helping through policies on setting appropriate rents. We should, from time to time, review our laws to see where improvements can be made. Today, it's incumbent upon us to make sure the system is helping those in need while ensuring taxpayers' funds are effectively and efficiently used. We must also remember why these programs are here and do what we can to reduce the limitations holding back our PHA's ability to tailor solutions to families and individuals who come with different circumstances. I want to reiterate that I truly believe we don't evaluate and measure success of these programs by how much money we spend. Instead, we should measure success by how many people we move out of poverty and into self-sustainability. Today, we'll be looking at a proposal from our Vice Chairman, Mr. Ross, to help families and individuals that are negatively impacted by the current income-based rent-setting formulas. The reforms in Mr. Ross's proposal will provide options for PHAs through rent-setting policies to incentivize housing assistance recipients to earn higher wages. Allowing rent to be tailored to a family or individual's own situation will help assist them to become self-sufficient with the ultimate goal of those families at some point not needing taxpayer assistance. Whether it is through the Family Self-Sufficiency Act, voucher mobility, or ensuring a path toward independence for our foster kids, I want to make sure that we are breaking down the walls that are keeping our families in a cycle of poverty from one generation to the next. I believe Mr. Ross's legislation will help in that effort, and I look forward to hearing from our panel, getting their feedback and insight on Mr. Ross's bill and what we might do to improve it and make it better. With that, I now recognize the gentleman from Missouri, the ranking member, Mr. Cleaver, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure I'll need the entire five minutes, but let me also welcome those of you who are here in the role of providing us with testimony and information. We appreciate your presence. This hearing centers on housing rent reform legislative proposals offered by Congressman Ross, titled Promoting Resident Opportunity Through Rent Reform. And as always, I appreciate a conversation on suggestions to improve federal housing programs. Having a stable home is a crucial component for children to succeed, for the elderly to thrive, and for veterans and the disabled to have a safe place to stay. And we've had study after study after study cite the importance of affordable housing for communities, and I have firsthand experience of the impact. The proposal we are considering today would allow public housing authorities to adopt new rent models for public housing and housing choice voucher programs. Specifically, the legislation would allow for tiered rent systems, stepped rent systems, rent based on gross incomes, shallow subsidy vouchers, or any other rent-setting policy that is approved by HUD. I have a number of concerns that these models could lead to large rent increases for families, as well as the elderly and disabled. I also believe that a program this varied would be very hard for HUD to oversee administratively. Additionally, just last week, we discussed the importance of enhancing voucher mobility to allow families to move from one area to another. This discussion draft would greatly increase, from my perspective, barriers for mobility, as each PHA may be overseeing drastically different rent models. In my hometown, for example, there were and are 3 distinct public housing developments. Last, Congress, then Housing and Insurance Subcommittee Chairman Luke DeMeyer and I co-sponsored the Housing Opportunity Through Modernization Act, HOTMA. This legislation made huge strides in improving and streamlining our public housing services. The bill passed unanimously in the House and was later signed into law. Currently, HUD is working on finalizing a number of HOTMA's provisions, and I look forward to seeing this process completed. But I got to tell you, and I don't think this has anything to do with partisan politics. Maybe I'm wrong, but there is some frustration on my part that HUD seems to be slow walking the implementation of this program. It's like they're saying so much to do and so little desire to do it. Unless we as a committee, an oversight committee, demand that HUD carry through with legislation that we approved, I don't think we're going to get any results from this or any other piece of legislation. So it seems to me that we shouldn't put any other legislative business before the full Congress until we have the implementation of what we've already approved. Or HUD needs to come in and explain something to us. So, Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back the balance of my time and look forward to a discussion.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the vice chair of this subcommittee, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Ross, for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for holding today's hearing on proposals to reform HUD's method of calculating rent for beneficiaries of our rental assistance programs. And thank you to our outstanding panel for joining us to share your expertise and your thoughts related to my legislation, the Promoting Resident Opportunity Through Rent Reform Act, or the Pro-Rent Reform Act of 2018. As most of you know, under the current rent regime, once a family is selected to receive HUD assistance, the rent they pay is generally based on 30% of their adjusted income. This is the essence of our income-based rental assistance model. There are an estimated 4 million families served by HUD's 5 main rental assistance programs and some 3,300 housing authorities embedded in communities across the nation charged with administering these programs. For years, we have forced our PHAs to administer a one-size-fits-all policy that zeroes out what should be a strength of our system, the proximity and sensitivity PHAs have to meet the needs of their local community. In addition, the one-size-fits-all policy we force PHAs to use itself is deeply flawed. It is well documented that income-based rents create an effective tax on success. Each time a tenant earns a raise or gets a new job, their cost of their housing chases after them. For most of us, a pay raise means more disposable income to save for the future or spend on household needs, but for the rent-assisted families, it just means higher rent for the same living space. Not only does this paradigm discourage work, it also limits a resident's opportunity to practice managing their own budgets, makes rent calculations complex and burdensome, and punishes dual-earning two-parent households. The discussion draft of the Pro-Rent Reform Act that we will examine today aims to address many of these shortcomings. It does so by empowering PHAs and their local communities through the very public annual plan certification process to select from a menu of alternative rent options, one which is better suited to serve the needs of their residents. To be very clear, the draft also ensures that if a PHA in its community likes the current system, they can continue to use it. There are a few additional important reforms in this bill, including a shallow subsidy for families on waiting lists and a move to a biannual income recertification, which I look forward to discussing with the panel. In closing, I want to emphasize that this is a discussion draft. It is not a final product. I am hopeful that today's hearing will produce insights on how we may improve upon this legislation, and I am eager to work with my colleagues on this subcommittee to develop a bill that we can win bipartisan support. I thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I do want to welcome our panel. Thank you for being here today and for offering your insights and intelligence on Mr. Ross's bill. With that, I am going to re-recognize Mr. Ross for the introduction of our first witness.
Thank you again, Chairman. It's my pleasure to introduce Mr. William Russell, President and CEO of the Sarasota Housing Authority in my home state of Florida. Mr. Russell joins us today representing the Florida Association of Housing and Redevelopment Officials, FARO, where he serves as a member of the Board of Directors and as chair of the FARO's Advocacy Committee. Mr. Russell began his tenure at Sarasota in 2005 following 3 years working for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development as a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Public Housing and Voucher Programs. When he first came to Sarasota, William Russell took over a HUD-designated troubled agency at the beginning of a rare federal receivership. In just a few short years, he was able to transform the agency into a consistent high performer in all areas, and he continues to push the envelope, seeking innovative ways to serve his community. We are fortunate to have Mr. Russell joining us today to share insights from his many years working alongside low-income families to help provide them with a place to live and an opportunity to thrive. I would like to thank him and all of the FARO members for partnering with me in an effort to fix our misguided rental assistance policies, the negative effects which they may experience firsthand almost every day. Mr. Russell, we are very much looking forward to hearing your testimony, and thank you again for taking time off from your important schedule to join us in this panel today. I yield back.
Mr. Russell, welcome. And I would just note that when you get introduced by a member from your home state, you get a very lengthy introduction, probably not offered to everybody else, but it's nice to have you here. We next welcome our second witness, Mr. Fisher, the Senior Policy Analyst at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Welcome. Ms. Todman is our third witness, the CEO of the National Association of Housing and Redevelopment Officials. Welcome, Ms. Todman. And finally, but not least, Mr. Gentry is the President and CEO of the California Housing Commission. To all of you, welcome. In a moment, you will all be recognized individually for 5 minutes to give an oral presentation of your written testimony. Without objection, the witness's written statement will be made part of the record following their oral remarks. Once the witnesses have finished presenting their testimony, each member of the subcommittee will have 5 minutes within which to ask the panel questions. I would just note that on your table there are 3 lights. It's pretty simple. The green light means go, the yellow light means that you have 1 minute left, and the red light means that your time is up. Pretty straightforward. Your microphones are sensitive, so if you don't hear yourself speaking, the microphone's probably not on, so just make sure when you're speaking you do have the microphone activated. They are sensitive, so speak directly into them. With that, Mr. Russell, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman Duffy, Vice Chair Ross, and Ranking Member Cleaver, and members of the subcommittee. My name is William Russell, and I appreciate the opportunity to testify today on behalf of the Florida Association of Housing and Redevelopment Officials, which represents 84 housing authorities. I'm a FARO board member and chair its advocacy committee. Last summer, FARO developed a rent reform proposal, which we shared with congressional and HUD staff. We are very pleased that Vice Chair Ross has embraced our proposal and incorporated it into the discussion draft before you today. Housing assistance should serve as a springboard of opportunity for the families we serve. However, current policy says to HUD-assisted families, the more you earn, the more you will pay in rent. There is little incentive to do better, only a promise of higher rent. Our families are not well served by current policy. We must ask ourselves these questions. Why would we keep a rent policy that discourages our residents from increasing their earned income? That is so complicated to calculate income and exclusions and deductions that it causes hundreds of millions of dollars in errors. That says if you quit your job voluntarily, we will immediately drop your rent to the absolute minimum under the law. That taxes 2-parent households by charging more rent for 2 incomes rather than encouraging it by allowing 2 working adults to share the rent. Current rent policy has the same economic cliff effect that plagues many federal anti-poverty programs. When families are on the verge of earning more and doing better, they peer over the edge of an economic cliff and see the benefits they stand to lose, such as food stamps, child support, and housing assistance. It is not surprising that some hesitate to lose that assistance and take a precautionary step back. We must correct this if we want families to reach their full potential. My written testimony provides several real examples of families making decisions to avoid rent increases and perceived economic instability. But let me discuss one recent example of that. A resident of ours found a job earning $35,000 a year working for an insurance company. Once her case manager notified her of her new rent portion, which was around $800, she decided to quit her job shortly thereafter. Her rent was then dropped to the statutory minimum rent of $50, and when the $75 utility allowance was applied for her unit, the housing authority paid her $25. Promoting resident opportunity through rent reform will improve things in three important categories. This reform will reduce barriers to economic advancement, provide reasonable options for local housing agencies to optimize economic opportunities in their community, and offer real simplification in how income and rents are calculated and the frequency of having to recertify income, thereby reducing subsidy errors and administrative burden on local agencies. The bill offers multiple rent options for housing providers and also allows them to develop other rent policies that HUD can approve. Several of these options offer real improvement over current policy and will help families make economic gains without being penalized. I provide more comments on each option in my written testimony and believe there is something here for every agency to work with to meet the needs of their community and their families. The shallow subsidy voucher is an optional policy tool to address the need for housing assistance that far exceeds available vouchers and causes agencies to close their wait lists for years on end. The shallow subsidy option offers families the rent assistance they need. That is the difference between covering their rent and being severely rent burdened or even homeless. In closing, I am grateful and honored to have the opportunity to appear before you today and provide testimony on the current HUD rent policy as well as the pro-rent reform discussion draft. As more families do better and graduate from assisted housing, more units become available to assist other families, and we will be able to serve more families over time. I ask that you give serious consideration to changing the current rent policy to encourage, not penalize, economic advancement and well-being. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Russell. The chair now recognizes Mr. Fisher for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Duffy, Ranking Member Cleaver, members of the subcommittee. It's a privilege to testify before you today. I want to start by emphasizing how much difference rental assistance programs make in the lives of low-income Americans today. They help more than 5 million low-income households keep a roof over their heads. The great majority of those are elderly, people with disabilities, and working families. Research shows that they're the most efficient and effective tool we have for reducing homelessness and housing instability. So these are effective, important, evidence-based programs under the current rules. That said, it's still important for policymakers to look for ways to strengthen them even further, and the HOTMA legislation that this committee developed is a great example of that. That included a whole set of careful policy changes, including substantial rent reforms that once HUD implements them will streamline administration, encourage work, and trim costs, while at the same time keeping in place the key program standards that have made rental assistance effective. Going forward, I think any changes beyond those in HOTMA should be done on an evidence-based manner. The Congress has directed HUD to conduct 2 major rent reform evaluations, which once they're completed, will provide findings on a whole range of alternative rent policies, including many of those in the bill that we're discussing today. I think it would be hard to justify enacting those proposals on a large-scale basis until those evaluations have been completed and you can assess what the impact of those policies is. I want to turn down a little more detail to the bill. I think it would be a step in the wrong direction for a few reasons. It would radically alter the public housing voucher programs in ways that would make them less effective. And the first reason is that it would result in large rent increases for low-income people that would increase hardship, evictions, and homelessness. It would allow HUD to increase rents on elderly people and people with disabilities by an unlimited amount. It would also allow very large rent increases for non-elderly, non-disabled people. For example, the tiered rent option in the bill would raise the minimum rent that housing agencies can charge the lowest income families by more than $500 on average per month. The second big concern is that the bill is not well designed to support work. I think increasing earnings and employment among rental assistance recipients is a really important goal, but there's no evidence that these proposals would do that, and a lot of them seem more likely to have the opposite effect. So just for example, the bill would allow very large rent increases on working poor families who can't afford market rents on their own. That would place them at greater risk of eviction, which would just make it harder for them to keep a job and raise their earnings. I think if policymakers want to support work, that it would be better to focus on initiatives like Jobs Plus or the Family Self-Sufficiency Act, which provide financial incentives and service coordination, but don't put families at risk of displacement and hardship. And the Family Self-Sufficiency Act, which the ranking member and the chair sponsored, and which the House passed overwhelmingly late last year, would be a big step in that direction that would strengthen the Family Self-Sufficiency Program. The third big concern is that this would make rental assistance much more complicated because it would allow the 3,800 state and local housing agencies that administer public housing and vouchers to each pick their own rent rules. Already having that many agencies is a complicated system that makes it much more difficult for voucher holders to move from one community to another, including to higher opportunity neighborhoods with good schools that would have important benefits for kids. I know there's been bipartisan concern around this, including the hearing that was held last week on legislation to promote regional cooperation to support voucher mobility. This bill would go in the opposite direction by creating much more fragmentation and complexity. A family that wanted to move would have to navigate a complex patchwork of local rent rules, frequently 10 or more in a single metropolitan area, just to figure out where they could use their subsidy and have a reasonable rent burden. In addition, the complexity would make it much harder for HUD to provide oversight over how taxpayer funds are used, and that's important because HUD oversight has played a central role in reducing payment errors by local housing agencies in the past. In summary, I'd urge the committee to set aside this bill. I think the most important concrete steps that can be taken in the near term to improve rent rules and support work are first for HUD to issue the regulations to implement HOTMA so that those reforms can begin to take effect. And second, for Congress to finish the job and enact the Family Self-Sufficiency Act so that program can help more families to earn and save and build a better future for themselves. So thank you again for the invitation to testify today, and I'll be happy to take any questions you have.
Thank you, Mr. Fisher. Ms. Todman, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman Duffy, Ranking Member Cleaver, and members of the subcommittee. I am Adrienne Todman, and I'm the CEO of NARO, and thank you for inviting me to testify today. This year, NARO celebrates its 85th anniversary as a membership organization for the affordable housing and community development industry. Our 20,000 members provide homes for more than 7.6 million people across the country in urban, rural, and suburban America. Rent reform is a concept that has been discussed and debated for decades. The current approach to rent was established in the 1960s when Congress capped public housing rent at 25% of residents' income, and then in 1981 raised the rental cap to 30%. While income-based rents are a well-intentioned measure, the unintended side effect is that this rent structure deprives housing authorities of the financial support needed to operate and maintain public housing. This is why the operating subsidy is such an important tool for housing authorities and, more importantly, the residents that they serve. While various important rent initiatives were authorized in HOTMA, they were not necessarily all encompassing, nor did they provide any alternative rent determination structures for housing agencies. We deeply appreciate Congress's efforts in streamlining the current rent recertification process through HOTMA, but most PHAs are still extremely limited in how they're allowed to charge their tenants rent. Just this week, we had our Washington conference, and we walked around and talked to some of our members about their thoughts about rent reform. A director out of Michigan said, all agencies, but particularly small ones, need flexibility and local control to meet the needs of their low-income families. Another senior housing official out of Texas focused on consistency and complexity, Real rent reform needs to address the two biggest issues with the current system: lack of transparency and consistency, and errors caused by this complexity. A sensible approach would simplify the calculation while ensuring that the subsidy is adequate for the local market. Currently, the only agencies allowed to shape and implement rent reform are moving to work agencies. And these agencies, it's important to note, have said they have done so gradually and cautiously. This includes many years of policy development, consensus building, and resident buy-in. As these rent reform proposals must be included within their moving to work plan, they must undergo a rigorous public comment before moving forward. This subcommittee has posed several questions to this panel. One question was around the era safeguards. Moving to work agencies have provided many examples of how hardship exemptions can be created so that there is rent reform, but you're also protecting the interests of the residents. In order to help residents achieve self-sufficiency and give them greater access to employment or career opportunities, many moving to work agencies have provided case management services. In fact, many of them rely on those case management services in order to have their rent reform initiatives be successful. Another question the committee has posed is whether or not rental assistance programs contribute to an over-reliance on government assistance. According to HUD's Picture of Subsidized Housing database, the vast majority of public housing program participants and voucher recipients are either already working or are households headed by disabled or elderly individual. But many critics of income-based rent believe it acts as a disincentive to work and add in family members to the lease. Another question was whether or not there needs to be, policymakers should ease regulatory burdens on housing providers, and I think that that is a resounding yes. I think that many housing authorities would say to you that given the amount of regulatory burdens that they have, they spend so much time on compliance and not enough time and energy in helping families in their homes. Although regulatory streamlining will help, no amount of regulatory streamlining will make up for the extremely deep cuts to programs that help support our nation's most vulnerable people and help to develop and revitalize communities. While NARA is deeply committed to regulatory reform, NARA notes that this reform does not replace the need for adequate funding for these essential programs. The final question was around flexibility to structure rent. Sadly, HUD has not yet implemented the components of HATMA that speak to this, so I agree with our previous two panelists that we do look forward to HUD putting those regulations in place, and we should really look at what has happened inside the moving to work agencies on how these different rent structures have been in place. Many of the proposed rent determination methods included here are already in effect across the country. But moving to work agencies have had the advantage of resources to really do the kind of case management and other initiatives that really help residents move out of or to live well inside their units. Thank you, Chairman Duffy, for inviting me to testify today, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Todman. Mr. Gentry, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Chair Duffy, Ranking Member Cleaver, and the other members of the subcommittee. Thank you for having me here today. I'll point out in starting that my career in the affordable housing industry spans almost 46 years, and I've had the privilege of working in a number of cities across the country during that time period. The agency that I've led for the last 10 years, the San Diego Housing Commission, provides federal rental assistance to more than 15,000 low-income San Diego households on the voucher program, and also operates some 189 federal public housing units. In addition, we operate a number of city and state finance programs as well, in addition to the federal. We also are one of the 39 public housing agencies nationwide to have received a Moving to Work designation from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. The Moving to Work status, as Ms. Taubman just indicated, gives those of us who are fortunate enough to have that designation the flexibility to create innovative, cost-effective approaches to provide housing assistance to the low-income families and the customers whom we serve. Based on the breadth of my experience, and I'll point out that I was a CEO both in Austin, Texas, and in Richmond, Virginia in the past, as well as also spending some considerable time in the private sector, I would submit that there are two guiding principles that should guide our housing programs nationwide. One is achieving the greatest benefit for the low-income families, the customers whom we serve,
and the second is maximizing efficiencies in the expenditure of taxpayers' funds. If there's a third item, it's far down the list from those two. With these principles in mind, the right types of rent reforms, I believe, can enhance the effectiveness of both the Section 8 voucher program and also the public housing program. I think there are two extremes, one currently in effect and one that's been proposed in the past that missed the mark. The current practice of utilizing income-based rents, I think, misses the mark by creating marked disincentives for productive behavior. In fact, in many cases, as Mr. Russell pointed out, they can be confiscatory and can hinder, if not prohibit, gainful activities on the part of our customers. I think the other extreme is that of term limits, which I think can serve the purpose of penalizing families frequently for being poor and not giving those families the help that they need to hopefully move up and out of their current situation. In San Diego, I will point out that there are two efforts that we kicked off as part of our Move Into Work experience that have made our rent reform work, I think, exceptionally well. The first is that in October of 2010, we opened our Achievement Academy. The Achievement Academy is a learning and resource center and computer lab with programs that emphasize career planning, job skills, and personal financial education. Achievement Academy staff, known as Work Readiness Specialists, are assigned to work with families on a customized plan for educational and employment objectives. Since 2011, more than 4,000 individuals have received one-on-one assistance from the Achievement Academy, and we've helped some 1,053 participants to date get placed in a job, and some 590 to get better jobs in their future. We set the Achievement Academy up on purpose before we started altering rents in order to give the residents a leg up. About 8 months after the Achievement Academy opened, HUD approved our Path to Success Rent Reform Initiative on June the 21st, 2011. This Path to Success program was created to encourage housing choice voucher families to become more financially self-reliant, with help again from the Achievement Academy. This initiative was first started in 2011 with a 2-year initial process. The first rents were implemented on July the 1st, 2013. Under our Path to Success program, we identified families as work-able or elderly disabled. A household is work-able if at least one adult is under 55 years old, not disabled, and not a full-time student between the ages of 18 and 23. I'll point out that the average annual income of our approximately 6,200 work-able families in this time period has increased 25% since 2011 to 2017, a six-year time period. All other households are considered elderly disabled. They do not participate in this program, and they're held harmless. I'll also point out that in addition to a minimum rent, which is based on the minimum wages for California families, we also instituted tiered rents for families that do have earned incomes who are in that policy set, and we've seen great success in this program. And that concludes my testimony, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Gentry. The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes for questions. Maybe just first off, does the panel agree that outside of those who are elderly or disabled, that it should be a goal that we should move folks through the assistance to self-sufficiency? Does anybody object to that concept? We all agree with that? Okay, good.
Well, let me just, I don't suggest that it's not something that I would disagree with. I just think that we need to be cautious on the practical application of that.
Right, but as a goal, how we get there we could discuss and debate, but that would be a noble goal of those who can get out. We should try to encourage that. And is it fair to say that if we have someone in one of our programs that, again, is potentially going to get a raise, someone who might have the opportunity to work more hours or overtime, or get a new job that pays them a little more, might be a little tougher job, but get more money from it, if that benefit is taken from them because they pay higher rents, is it a fair human assessment that that's a disincentive? Does anybody disagree with that concept?
So I
Mr. Fisher?
That could be provided disincentive. I think the important, sorry.
No worries.
So I was saying, I think an important clarification is that for the great majority of folks on rental assistance, the great majority of families on rental assistance, because of the incentives that are provided by other programs like the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit, they're going to be better off working in a low-wage job than they are not working. So I think I think it's important to recognize that those families do have are better off working than they are not working.
But I'm talking about this program, where you have a disincentive. That's some of that extra earned income is going to be taken away from you. And at first blush, I would tell you, it makes sense. If you make more money, you should pay more for your rent. At first blush, that makes a lot of sense until we look at human behavior. And then we might say, well, oh my gosh, if I work harder and earn more and I just have to give that away in increased rents, I'm not going to work harder. It seems like that's common human nature. Mr. Russell, do you agree with that concept?
I do agree with that. And one of the examples that I talk about in my rent testimony is a dual income couple, and they had a goal of becoming homeowners. So they decided they would actually both be willing to work a second job to get ahead and help save up to buy a home. And I would think that would be something we would want our housing policy to support. And as soon as they started working that second job and increasing their income, as you said, the rent jumped up and was chasing after that increased income, and they finally just decided, well, what's the point of working a second job if we can't even get ahead? So, they pulled back, and they didn't. I mean, they kept their current jobs, but that incentive to work harder and do better and save up and buy a home of their own, they felt like that whole effort was being defeated by the rent policy.
I know this might be kind of shocking. Mr. Ross is a Republican who introduced this bill, and Republicans are allegedly always trying to take money away from people and save. I think that Mr. Cleaver is giving me a hard time. Listen, but a common sense policy that says I think people are better off if we care about people's lives and what gives them worth, to make sure we give them a roadway to self-sufficiency and to let them keep a little more of their hard-earned money to get to that bridge point where they can make it on their own. In the end, aren't we better off as a society, letting them keep a little more at the front end? In the long run, they're the ones that get to step out and get out of the programs and thrive and not just survive. Mr. Gentry, do you agree with that?
Yes, sir, I do.
Your microphone.
Yes, sir, I do. I'd point out that if you're a behavioralist, and I am, and you believe that people respond to sanctions as well as to incentives, that we want folks to engage in the American dream of being able to be productive and to be self-sufficient insofar as possible. Now, there may be some folks who are elderly, disabled, or have other issues need to be taken care of.
That's right.
And I think that to understand some of the objections to this, we need to make sure that if folks have a hardship situation, or if they need some time to work their way into understanding how to work in a productive setting, those kinds of opportunities can be made available to them. I think that's where the San Diego's Achievement Academy has been greatly successful. And again, I'll point out that in the 4 years from 2013 to 2017, we showed an average income increase among our work-able families of 25%.
My time is up, but I want to ask a quick question, because this is meaningful in the way I view the world, and I think what evidence would show us is that it's not always possible, but if we can raise our kids in a two-family home, it's probably better for the kids, and the odds of poverty are diminished with a two-family home. Does this program, the way it's structured today, disincentivize marriage in a two-family home, Mr. Russell?
We believe it does. When we look at the demographics of our families and we compare it to the surrounding community, it doesn't match up in terms of the disproportionate number of single female-headed households that occupy our units. I was raised by a single mom, so it's
kudos to single moms.
I'm not, but certainly, I mean, I think it would be positive for our community and our kids to have more two-parent households in our communities, and quite frankly, the policy just discourages that.
And if it's a benefit, we should try to structure our policy to incentivize it instead of maybe having a policy that may be a disincentive to marriage or a husband and wife living together. My time is way over. Thank you for answering my questions. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me first of all say to the gentleman from Florida, before I say that, when you start out, you said Pharaoh instead of Pharaoh, and in my district, Pharaoh doesn't poll well, so I was obviously a little nervous, but thank you. It is important, I think, for me to say, I agree 100% with the concept of your outline of legislation, and as you're thinking about it, I think it might be important for some of the things that I've said to at least be considered, or maybe even more appropriately from what our distinguished panel says. And I'm interested, Mr. Fisher, you know, my concern, I mean, HUD right now is going through this rent reform demonstration to test the impact of higher rents and calculating rent based on gross income. And so I think the report is due out 2020, yeah, something like that. And so what I was trying to say, perhaps inarticulately, was that I'm concerned about implementing proposals without the results of the programs we just put in place. Is that a legitimate concern, just based on your information presented to us?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely a legitimate concern. I mean, these evaluations, the rent reform demonstration they're doing now, and some ones that they plan as part of a moving to work expansion, are going to test, you know, tiered rents, stepped rents, the whole range, a whole range of alternative policies, and we'll know much more about what they do after those evaluations are completed.
Thank you. Ms. Todman, last week, we started running together if you're in this place, but we considered a proposal either last week or the week before about increased mobility, which I support completely. But will that proposal be a barrier to this proposal be a barrier to tenant mobility, given that neighboring PHAs could possibly have different rent models?
So I had the great honor of running a housing authority in my previous life, and one of the things that we do is when a resident is ready to, in this case, port out into another agency, as the welcoming agency, we sit down with residents and guide them in terms of what the rules and regulations are inside of that housing authority. So I do think that, I don't see that the bill does need some perfecting, but I don't see in and of itself that it would be a disincentive for families to move from one place to another. In its current state, I think that families will move based upon the current state of their household and their housing needs.
Thank you. Now, my final question, Mr. Gentry, as I stated earlier, I think this is a very good concept, and hopefully it will develop into a very good piece of legislation. But I don't know how HUD can possibly administer this program, adding some additional program management, when we have actually been cutting HUD's budget year after year after year. So I'm wondering about the administrative burden that will fall on HUD, and the additional dollars we went to community development block grants. To my knowledge, we're not expanding anything administratively. So is that a legitimate concern, Mr. Gentry?
Yes, sir, I think it is. However, I don't think we should limit the application of a good idea based on the lack of ability of a group of folks to implement it. I think that the good idea should be implemented, and then the administration should be required to keep up, quite frankly, to make sure it does work. I'll point out, too, that the way I look at it, and I do believe in mobility and allowing people to make a choice in where they live, what they do, where they want to work, how much of that money they can keep for themselves, as much as they can. But I think mobility should be economically up, should be the primary factor, rather than looking for another place to move to. And already, if you move from one community to another, you're going to encounter differences in a lot of different factors where you move to. So the way I look at it is not using our organizations or our programs as a way to protect our people who are work-able from the larger economy, but to help those people fully engage it.
Yeah, I agree with you. All of the studies show that if you move from a lower income area to a higher income area, that mobility does create a whole new world for the PHA resident. Yield back. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the author of the underlying bill, the vice chairman of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Ross, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll remind the members that this is a working draft. And my good friend from Missouri raises some good points, and I apologize on my initial pronunciation of the acronym. I think I was hooked on phonics at the time. So, but my concern, and the reason I think this hearing is important, is because I don't believe, nor do I ever think, that the intended goal of public housing, with very few exceptions, was to create permanent housing. In fact, I think just the opposite. I think it has been, in its initial conception, as a starting point for those to do what many Americans have done throughout the history of this country, and that's to be able to gain economic growth and go up in a mobile fashion throughout their community into a successful livelihood. In fact, work is actually synonymous with dignity. Dignity is a byproduct of work. And so what we have here is not that one size is going to fit all. And I think we would all have to agree that whatever housing policies are in New York City aren't going to work in Laramie, Wyoming, or in Lakeland, Florida, or in New Orleans, Louisiana. We have to have some sense of flexibility. And those flexibilities, I think, are dependent upon the communities with which those public housing residents live. And so what we've seen here and what we have today that I'm very grateful for is some testimony from witnesses who have experienced the innovative programs, the Moving to Work program Mr. Gentry has, Mr. Russell's program in Sarasota, Florida, Ms. Todman's efforts in Washington, D.C. All these are based upon incentives to allow people to improve their social and economic situation. I think that's what the intended purpose of our public housing programs are. And so what I would like to do, Mr. Russell, some stakeholders have expressed concerns that the Pro-Rent Reform Act is too complicated for PHAs to implement, and that it's unlikely that communities will ever take advantage of the flexibility to choose a new rent calculation method. Do you agree with that?
I don't at all. I think, I know your bill includes an option to basically have a housing authority to say—
An option, correct.
An option to stay with the status quo. And I think that's a fine option to have in the bill, but I can't imagine a housing authority deciding to stay with the status quo. Just, again, given the complexity, the errors. I mean, we get audited for compliance with these complex rules every year. Our audits come in and audit our books, but they also audit our compliance. And it's really hard to have no findings on compliance because this rent policy is so complicated.
And why do you think it's important for alternative rent options to be included in the statute as opposed to having HUD promulgate a rule to bring about that reform?
Well, I think the options that are laid out in the bill are, I think, reasonable options. They're options that have been demonstrated in the Moving to Work program. Obviously, you included a provision where someone could be creative and propose a new option to HUD for their consideration. But I think, giving HUD the full discretion to put out options—
That would adversely impact your current program today, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, it would. And you've been pretty successful. I mean, it's impressive to see what you've done from a borderline agency. Mr. Gentry, the Moving to Work program, I mean, that's something that we're delighted that we've been able to see activated here, even though it's on a pilot project. How long did it take you to put together your Path to Success program, and how resource intensive was the project?
I moved to San Diego in late 2008, and the Move Into Work program had been suspended, believe it or not, prior to my arrival. We reactivated it in January of 2009, and Move Into Work, or I'm sorry, the Path to Success program, we kicked off 2 years later. We wanted to institute the Achievement Academy first, because we saw that before we started talking about helping a resident improve their economic livelihood, we needed to have a mechanism to help them do that. So it took us about 2 years to grow into that, and then another 2 years to get the program fully functioning and implemented, so that when we hit the ground running on the new rents, both the new minimum rents and the new rent tiers, in July of 2013, we needed to have a good program developed, which we did, and we also needed to publicize it and communicate it among our residents. And we spent 2 full years doing that. So it took about 4 years, sir, to get it operating the way we wanted it to, but when we kicked it off, it started hitting on all cylinders all at once in 2013.
And the tiered rent scheme has not been a problem at all, has it?
No, sir.
Thank you.
And the tiered rent is not unlike, this is April income taxes, it's not unlike tiered taxes, so that you get the benefit of the income within those tiers before your income picks up. We also re-examine our families every other year, so you get a full year's benefit before an increased income kicks in. And then what we also have done with the residents is make sure that, and again, we are heavily a Section 8 agency, mainly because we transitioned most of our public housing to vouchers also early during my tenure in San Diego. So we've got almost 16,000 vouchers, 189 public housing units. So in the voucher program, as people's income rises, eventually they don't need the program anymore.
Right.
Very easy to transition. I'll point out, however, that and this is true nationally as well as in San Diego, well over half of our participating families or individuals are elderly, disabled, hardship situations, and those are off the table, and for those, the old rents apply.
Absolutely. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Kewen, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. And thank you all for being here this afternoon. I just have a couple of quick questions. The first one to Mr. Fisher. During the recession, as you well know, Nevada was ground zero for the housing crisis. Thousands of Nevadans lost their homes, and many were pushed into the rental market. Nevada is now facing an affordability crisis with a shortage of more than 81,000 affordable and available rental homes for extremely low-income renters, despite many of them working full-time. In Nevada, to afford a 2-bedroom rental home at HUD's fair market rent, a person would need an annual income of $37,462. However, there's no state in the U.S. where a person working full-time at the federal minimum wage can afford a 2-bedroom apartment at fair market rent. Wage inequality in this country continues to grow. The average minimum wage worker in my state earns less than $18,000 a year. So my question is, what will be the impact of the Ross bill on individuals who are already working full-time but still cannot afford the cost of rent in the private market?
Well, it would allow very large rent increases for those families, in some cases hundreds of dollars a month. Those would be increases, since like you said, these are families who are doing their best to make ends meet and make a living. They don't have the ability to cover those costs. They'd have to divert money away from other basic needs, things like clothing or school supplies. And ultimately, they'd face a much higher risk of eviction and being left without a home. And the impact of that's going to fall most heavily on the kids in those families who could lose their homes and have lots of other harmful effects.
Thank you. And a quick follow-up. There are many who argue that the families who receive this federal rental assistance, who are able to work, are not working. What does the data tell us about this assumption?
The overwhelming majority of people on rental assistance are elderly, have disabilities, or they're workers. So there's 85% that either are elderly, have a disability, worked, or recently worked. Among the people who are left, a lot of them have other health limitations that don't qualify as a disability, but they make it very difficult for them to work. There are others who are responsible who care for young children or for disabled adults and don't have access to affordable care for those people. So the share of people who are readily able to work and don't is very small.
Thank you. And just one more question. While there's virtually no evidence that the punitive rent increases actually encourage workable individuals to work, there is substantial evidence supporting the effectiveness of the Family Self-Sufficient Program. Can you talk a little bit about why this is a better approach to encouraging self-sufficiency?
Sure. So the Family Self-Sufficiency and then a related thing is the Jobs Plus demonstration, and both of these are programs that provide financial carrots. They provide financial incentives for people to raise their earnings, but they don't pull the rug out from under working families or other people and risk causing hardship in the way that the rent increases in this bill would. And so for both of those programs, there have been encouraging research findings that show very large earnings increases, and I think that they're both promising ways to go forward and help what I think we all agree is the goal, which is to help these families raise their earnings and succeed.
Correct. Thank you, Mr. Fisher. And then my last question to Ms. Todman. Thank you again for being here. The Ross discussion draft does not provide any additional resources for case management, job training, or other services that would help residents take steps to increase their earned wages. In your experience, how important are these kinds of supportive services in achieving success for families?
They're certainly very, very important. And there's a distinction between what moving to workers and non-moving to workers has been able to do per my testimony. But I will say this much. Non-moving to work agencies are actually very, very well equipped to partner and to create collaboration at the local level, even without the additional resources. I think what allows the moving to work agencies to do is to create their own program in a way and be more intentional. But there's thousands of examples across the country where housing authorities have partnered with their local Department of Employment Services or nonprofits to be able to afford those kind of case management for their residents.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Todman, and I yield the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Holcomb, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all. Appreciate your work and your testimony here today. Mr. Gentry, if I can address my first question to you, and listening to your testimony, it seems to me that you have some understanding of the affordable housing needs in Chicago and the rest of Illinois from your time with the National Equity Fund in Chicago. Despite inflation, the current minimum rent for non-moving to work agencies of $50 has not been increased since 1998. On page 8 of your testimony, you state that as of July 1st, 2015, households with one workable person, work-able person, pays a minimum rent of $300. Got several questions. If I could, I'll give them to you all, and then if you can kind of touch on the ones that you feel able to discuss, that'd be great. One, do you believe that a minimum rent standard is good public policy, and if so, why? How do we address the concerns that some residents have absolutely no income, and how do they even survive? What would be the effect of a minimum rent increase across the board for all agencies? And then what types of hardship exemptions and processes should be in place to make sure the minimum rent policy doesn't have unintended adverse consequences to those who truly are unable to afford at least $50 a month?
Well, the short answer is it depends.
Next.
The longer answer is that if you notice in my paper, San Diego has no minimum rent if you're not work able. If you are elderly, disabled, hardship situation for a relatively short period of time, there is no minimum rent. Our assumption in those cases is that we work with the family through our Achievement Academy and hook them up with non-earned income that would be appropriate to them. Social Security, SSI, welfare, food stamps, whatever would be appropriate to help that family, which we should be doing anyway. So, but for a work-able family, if you remember our definition of that, there's at least one individual in that family who is under 55, who is not a full-time student, under 23, and is not disabled. So that particular family will work with them and help them find a job. But rather than trying to make it more complicated perhaps than it should be, we figure that if we're offering help and they're work able, they should be paying a minimum rent based on minimum wages. And it's been remarkable to me how few complications or problems we've had with this since we implemented it in 2013. I'll point out with respect to the FSS program, it's a wonderful program, but I think it only goes halfway. Basically, it says we're still going to charge you an exorbitant confiscatory rent based on your income, but we're going to give some of it back to you. So if a family can look at it that way, then it makes sense. It's better than not having FSS, and I do support it, but it's only halfway there. Better, I think, that we assume that our residents who, in my 46 years in this business, some of the low-income people I've worked with are some of the best financial managers I've ever met.
That's right.
Who can get a long way on a minimum amount of money. We need to treat them with dignity and respect and basically say, we'll help you, we expect you to do it, and we think you can carry it off. And so far, at least in San Diego, it's working very well.
That's great. Let me go on in my last minute and a half here to Mr. Russell, if I could. On page 2 of your testimony, you referenced that the current rent policy, and I quote, taxes two-parent households by charging more rent for two incomes rather than encouraging a cohesive family unit by allowing two working adults to share the rent burden, end quote. What if you could provide some more context based on your experience of the connection between the current rent policies and quasi-punishment of the maintenance of two-parent households?
Well, you know, in the non-HUD assisted world, there is an economic benefit to having a two-parent household with dual income or with the second parent, you know, assisting with things that would otherwise, you know, cost money to do. And sharing the rent, splitting the rent, for example. Under our policy, they can't share the rent. They can't split the rent. There is no economic benefit to having a two-parent household. There's actually a penalty to do that, because if the second parent or second adult has income, we have to charge them more rent accordingly. And it's kind of insidious, because we have single female heads of households who have significant others that they want to have residing with them, but because of the rent policy and the discouragement of that, they literally have, you know, someone kind of sneaking in and out at night and hoping to not be discovered by the housing authority. And then if we find out, it becomes like a fraud issue. And that's a terrible climate that our policy is creating for people who just want to have a two-parent household. We should be encouraging that, not discouraging that.
Well, my time's expired. Thank you. I yield back, Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and thank the witnesses for appearing and for your testimony here today. I don't think there's a single member of Congress that likes the word homeless, and I like to think that every member of Congress would like to do whatever they could to effectively make sure we didn't have anybody that was homeless. I'm especially chagrined today to hear that we actually penalize married people or couples. I think the family model is probably the best thing we can do to help people advance forward. And I always thought the goal of public housing was to help people along until they can get into private housing, not to entrap them in public housing for their entire lives. Mr. Russell, and then I'll ask the other panelists, what percentage of public housing residents annually, let's say, graduate to private housing? And you can swag it. I mean, I'm not going to hold any of you to this number. I'm just really curious.
Yeah, I would say, in my agency, I would say maybe about 5%.
Okay. Mr. Fisher?
Well, I was just going to say, so I don't have that figure off the top of my head, and it varies a lot from one agency to another. So, for example, in high-rent markets like New York City, it's a lower number because it's really hard for a working family to afford housing on their own. But the number that I do have is that the The average length of stay is about 3 years, both in public housing and vouchers. So that's what's typical.
Okay. Ms. Taubman?
Yeah, that was going to be the nature of my response too, which is the average tenure. I don't think that there's any data on how many individuals leave public housing and voucher program and go into the rental market. I will say in my own experience, how that's happened is by having families graduate into homeownership programs that have been created by the Housing Authority, and also helping them go into the tax credit units. But there's not a hard number that I can.
Okay. Mr. Gentry?
I can give you a specific number on a smaller cohort with a broader program based in San Diego.
Okay.
The San Diego Housing Commission owns and operates about 3,700 units of hard housing, hard units. Only 189 of those are public housing. The others are all affordable, mainly based on a local model, some tax credits, some based on Section 8 rents that are purely locally developed. 5 years ago, our turnover rate was 35% a year. That means in a 3-year time period, it would all turn over, because as we came out of the Great Recession, because of the overbuilding that occurred that you heard about a while ago, whether it was in Las Vegas or San Diego or Florida or where, there was a place to move up and out too. The turnover rate now has gone from 35% to 14%.
Okay.
Meaning it takes a 7-year time period. That has less to do with our programs, though, than it has to do with the broader economic circumstances within San Diego. We've seen, and this is going on in every high-cost area in the country, and probably this will be the subject of another hearing.
Right.
But the next tier to move up into has gotten much more difficult, and I think the way that would translate to what we're talking about here is it makes it even more difficult when we're punishing families from increasing their own economic base, for them to then access an ever-increasingly expensive market.
Okay, thank you. Do any of you know where there are requirements for able-bodied people to seek education, job training, or such requirements? Or is that a requirement anywhere?
So again, there's a number of moving to work agencies that have put into place some measured time limits and also some work requirements. And there's still lots of work being done in terms of the impact that has had at the local level. We have been speaking to those agencies over the past several weeks about what has the impact on the ground really been. And their response to us is they take great lengths to not harm the family with the term limits and work requirements. And what they do is wrap case management around the household to ensure that they can be successful, but they're really heavy on the hardships.
Thank you.
Exemptions.
Mr. Russell, on page 2 of your testimony, you referenced that the current rent policy taxes two-parent households by charging them more rent for 2 incomes rather than encouraging a cohesive family unit by allowing 2 working adults to share the rent burden. Could you provide more context based on your experience of the connection between the current rent policies and the quasi-punishment of the maintenance of the two-parent households?
Yes, well, as I mentioned that, under the current rent policy, I have no flexibility in how I treat the second adult income in the household. So if a family, if a single head of household wants to have their partner or spouse move in and share in the economic burden of raising the family and supporting their rent, I have to increase their rent based on that income. I have no discretion to give them a break where they would be able to share a rent in unsubsidized housing.
And you think that this legislation will give you the latitude that you need to make a two-parent household more practically applicable?
I do, and I think I may have noted in some of my written testimony that under a couple of the options, there probably could be a couple of tweaks to allow us to offer a steep discount on that second wage earner's income and not charge the full rent on that second income. But yes, I believe it does give us that option.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Rothfuss, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to keep going with Mr. Russell here. talking about flexibility that you may or may not have. Do you have any flexibility that's available in a non-moving to work situation?
Not much to speak of.
How does that lack of flexibility affect your ability to help assistance beneficiaries transition out of public assistance?
Well, to be honest with you, it's discouraging because we're doing a lot in my agency to help families provide services, complete their GED, get job training. We're very focused on early childhood literacy to give our kids a bright opportunity. And again, whether it's two-parent households or families who are, trying to do better and work harder, it's very discouraging to see some of the decisions that they're making because of how our current rent policy penalizes them doing better. And
let me ask you a follow-up to what Mr. Posey was talking about, because we touched on the two-parent, two-income families. Have you seen one or both parents quit their jobs or scale down their hours?
Yes.
Wow. That's telling. Ms. Todman, in your testimony, you discussed how moving to work housing agencies are using their rent policy flexibilities. Can you describe how these agencies have used these flexibilities?
Certainly. They have some of them have instituted flat rents within income bands, similar to what Mr. Gentry referred to, where you earn income, it's not an automatic hit on the earned income. It doesn't increase. It doesn't increase in the rent until you get to the next income band. So a number of them have done that. Others have actually eliminated deductions in their calculation of rent, which is an adjusted rent, eliminated deductions and gone to just a simple 28% or 27% of gross income across the board. So there's been a number of different models, but those two have been the most prevalent.
Many of us see facilitating upward mobility and decreased dependency among the able-bodied as important goals that should be part of our public assistance programs. Do you view rent policy flexibility as an important component of the toolkit that should be provided?
I think that rent reform is important for two reasons. One is just the simplification of the process. As you've heard Mr. Russell say, it's very, very complicated for our housing agencies to do this often and sometimes do it very well. But the other is tied to some of the disincentives that are tied to adding a family member to the household and also getting a job or a better job. And so I think for those two reasons, rent reform is something that we should pursue.
Thank you. Mr. Gentry, I think we talked a little bit about today about metrics of success and some viewing full occupancy as one measure. I mean, it is a measure because there are people in need who we want to make sure are going to have a place to live. But beyond that, there needs to be stage two, and moving people up. What do you think a measure or a metric of success can or should be?
I think certainly for the work able, helping families to achieve economic independence, or at least greater degrees of it, is an absolute essential. And I think also for the broader community, there's one group of people who do not have a natural group of advocates here, and those are the folks on our waiting list. In San Diego, we consistently have over 60,000 families on the waiting list for 15,000 plus vouchers with a turnover rate of 50 to 75 per month. You can do the math. There's a growing need without a growing...
There have been people on waiting lists for years.
The typical wait is anywhere from 7 to 10 years, sir. And San Diego also has a huge homeless issue, which is there for a variety of reasons. So I think that measures of success are not always clear, but I think they certainly should reflect values. And those values should be helping families insofar as possible to become economically self-sufficient, while providing a safety net for those like the elderly or the disabled who are not in that category, and providing options too for our from our limited resources for those families who need the help but are currently not getting it.
Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Cleaver, for a point of personal privilege.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent to enter a letter from the G7U housing organization led by the National Low Income Housing Coalition into the record for today's hearing.
Without objection. And if I could ask the ranking member just to ask the panel one last question before we adjourn. And if I could just have everyone answer this, and just I want some clarity from the panel. In regard to elderly and disabled, how will they be impacted by giving PHAs flexibility, if at all? Maybe if I could just go down the line, Mr. Russell.
Well, FARA's goal is to hold them harmless. And I think the bill discusses giving HUD some discretion about setting, a rent policy that, with the goal being, we're not charging any additional rent for the elderly or disabled. And hopefully we can create a process that's a little more dignified and simplified for them. I mean, right now we have elderly people literally bringing in shoe boxes of medical receipts, and that's not dignified. And so the goal would be to simplify it, but not to at all increase their rent burden going forward.
Okay, Mr. Fisher.
Well, I mean, that's not what this bill does. It allows HUD to impose unlimited rent increases on the elderly and people with disabilities. That's what the language allows. They can set percent of gross rent with no cap. And this is a HUD that has repeatedly proposed to raise rents on the elderly and people with disabilities. In last year's budget, just today, released legislation that would do that, would propose to do that again. So I think they would be harmed by the bill.
But it's not mandatory.
It's not mandatory for HUD, but they've said they want to do it.
But for the PHA, it's not mandatory either.
No, it's mandatory for the PHAs. In this bill, it's mandatory for the PHAs.
Ms. Todman?
As evidenced by those housing authorities that have access to this level of flexibility, they have tended to use rent reform to help to relieve administrative burdens from our seniors and our disabled population. On the flip side, where they've actually instituted work requirements or time limits, they've exempt the elderly and disabled from that through hardship exemptions.
Okay. Ms. Gentry.
And I would agree with Mr. Russell's comments entirely, and that does reflect San Diego's practice and policy.
Very well. Listen, I want to thank our witnesses for their testimony today. I appreciate your insight to this committee as we look forward with this discussion draft to take your points of view and those of others and try to get a proposal that's bipartisan but also works. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions to the chair, which will be forwarded to our witnesses. I ask the witnesses to please, if we get some of those, respond within a timely manner. Without objection, this hearing is now adjourned.